The following featured presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. I'm one of your hosts, James Floyd. I'm a freelance writer for StarWars.com and Star Wars Insider Magazine.
And I'm Melissa Miller. I also write for Star Wars Insider Magazine, and I am the science and technology writer at Nerdist. This episode, Star Warsologies, is going to chat about religion as represented in Star Wars by the Jedi Order, the Ewoks worshipping C-3PO, Djarin's Mandalorian sect, and so much more. Our guest expert today is Father Andrew Kinstetter. He's a Roman Catholic priest in the diocese of Cheyenne, Wyoming, and goes by the nickname Father Fett. Welcome, Father Andrew. Thanks for being here.
It is a joy to be here today to talk religion with you guys.
Thanks so much. Can you briefly define what is religion? Tell us a little bit about how you pursued this calling to become a priest.
Sure. And I'll tie in my Star Wars love into all of that because it has a really kind of fun sort of connection together. I guess if you want to talk about religion just kind of in a very, very broad manner, essentially religion is a voluntary subjection of oneself to God. Coming from a Catholic point of view, it's God himself as revealed through the Bible. My story, in a very brief sense, I grew up in Wyoming. I'm a Wyoming native, but I've always been a geek. I've always loved, video games, Star Wars. My friends make fun of me because Star Wars Episode 2 was the first Star Wars movie that I saw in theaters. And so that has become, it's my favorite movie out of all of them. And so I know it gets a lot of people kind of talk bad about it or, whatever they want. It's all cool. But seeing Jango Fett in that movie really just kind of resonated with me as a kid. He's got this kind of mysterious background. He's got this cool armor. And so I've always just had a particular been a fan of him and his character. And so kind of fast forward in my personal life, I grew up Catholic and God was calling me to be a priest, but I wasn't really listening in high school. So actually I went to college to study computer science for 3 years in South Dakota. That was a really good time for me, but it was also a time for me to really embrace my Catholic faith as my own. And it wasn't just something mom and dad made me do, but it was something that I chose to do and to really give my life to my Catholic faith. And it wasn't just something that was habitual. And during those 3 years at the School of Mines and Technology where I was at, basically, I became less and less joyful in pursuing computer science. And I was more joyful when I was helping out at youth group and when I was helping out being chaperone at retreats or, helping out with the cathedral in various ways in different retreats and stuff. And of course, I had good relationships with the priest too. So I was always talking to them and they were always asking, well, have you ever, considered this? And there came a point when I just had to say, well, I need to go to seminary to really discern where God was calling me. Went to seminary and went to Missouri, actually. So I was at a Benedictine monastery for 2 years. And really there was able to study philosophy and study theology, but also just kind of listen to what God was saying in my heart and grow as a man and grow into all of that. And then I spent 4 years at St. John Vianney Theological Seminary in Denver. And that's where I got my master's of divinity and was ordained a priest in Cheyenne in 2016. To circle back just a little bit, Star Wars became a huge part of all of this in a very cool way, because when I was a kid and liking Star Wars, it was I was a closet Star Wars geek because it wasn't fashionable to be a geek in high school. And, so I would have my Star Wars novels and I would read those during school, but I wasn't really I didn't broadcast that I was a Star Wars geek because I got made fun of for it. And one of the cool things about going through seminary and growing as a human person and listening to God and all of this sort of thing was the realization that God creates each of us unique, and he creates each of us with particular passions, desires, hobbies, and those are all good. And so to embrace my Star Wars fandom was a way in which I was able to embrace how God created me and to love that and then to share that and not be ashamed of that. So that was a really cool kind of process to go through. And so it became sort of my Star Wars fandom became just kind of connected to who I am, even as priest. Even my parishioners know that I run a Star Wars podcast. Actually, been doing that for a couple of years, called The Secrets of Star Wars, where we talk about Star Wars and our Catholic faith. There's 5 of us on the podcast, and we all talk about the new shows and everything, but all from our Catholic faith point of view. And so, like, to do those kind of things, and even on social media, I'm known as Father Fett. And of course, that's a reference to Jango Fett and my love of his character, but also who I am as priest. So it's sort of been this real cool merging of the two, my Star Wars fandom and my role and who I am as a Catholic priest.
Well, I was raised in the Catholic Church. I did communion, did not go through confirmation. And I was also raised a huge Star Wars fan. So there's definitely aspects of it. For me, the one that really stands out, and when I still go to Catholic services today, that sort of call and response, may the force be with you. I can't be the only one who always wants to say, and also with you.
Right.
And I'm just...
right.
Or now, and with your spirit.
Right. Yep. One of the great things about any good story is it's going to have elements of this in it. You have good and evil, and you have kind of the call to service. You could say that my call to be a priest would be analogous to kind of what you were saying, is that God is calling me to this form of service and sacrifice and this life. But the same would be true for people who are called to be mothers and fathers, and those who are called to serve, in all sorts of different ways. And what's beautiful about it is that there's this call to something greater. And, and that's the whole that's part of religion, is that we're recognizing that this life is not all about me, and it's not all about what I want, but that there's something greater at play. God created us for a purpose. I often like to reiterate all over and over to my parishioners that God created us out of love for love. And so ultimately, that's the core of religion, is that we're searching for happiness, but not happiness in kind of a fleeting temporal happiness, but we're searching for ultimate happiness and perfection that can only be found in love of God, love of neighbor. And so then God calls us out of our day-to-day life to pursue that in some way, whether it's to serve in ministry as a priest, as a religious brother or sister, like I said, as a mom or a dad. There are those who are called to just the single life and are called to minister. But you see that too, very clearly in Star Wars too. And that's what's so great about Star Wars, is it's such a wonderful lens in which to look at our own lives and to kind of figure things out. And you can throw these situations at the characters in Star Wars and play with how they would respond. And it informs us how we should respond. You've got Luke, for example, of course, who, grew up on Tatooine, didn't really know that there was this bigger world out there. And he gets that call from C-3PO and R2-D2 and Obi-Wan Kenobi and the whole story there. But he even resists the call initially. He wants to go back to the farm and doesn't want to pursue that, but is kind of forced into it. And that's the whole hero's journey aspect as well. But ultimately, that's what leads him to that fulfillment, saving Princess Leia, joining the rebellion, and pursuing that sort of life. He's giving his life in service as a Jedi and priests. There's a lot of parallels there. There's the celibacy parallel. There's the monastic sort of setting of the Jedi in the temple, meditation, prayer, those sorts of things. A call to kind of sacrifice the world in order to provide a service for the greater good.
But
there's all of that.
Does that mean you have a lightsaber and get to use it?
There are 3 of them hanging on my wall behind me.
Probably doesn't come up a lot during your sermons, but maybe.
So I usually don't talk about Star Wars in my sermons. I know that there are some priests who do. This is totally just kind of a side note. It's not because I don't want to, or not because I'm not familiar with it. It's the problem with bringing them up in homilies is you have to assume that everybody's seen it and everybody knows. And if they don't, then you have to explain the plot or whatever you're talking about. I'm always worried that that's going to take too much away from the actual message that I'm focusing on. So people talk Star Wars to me always after Mass or.
What would be great is at celebration, on Sunday, maybe you could give services, right? Because that would be your target audience. You wouldn't have to explain plot. You wouldn't have to explain anything.
The Star Wars fans, they're my people. They are the ones whom I can relate to and can talk with. And of course, I merge that with my Catholic faith. Yeah, it would be really fun to gather the Catholics at celebration and celebrate Mass with them.
So you mentioned like the monasticism aspect of both the Jedi and the Catholicism, and then also kind of the going out into the world to serve, that the Jedi go out in pairs. Is there, a parallel there as well?
Real quick, I don't know this term monasticism. Is it just having to do with monastery?
Yeah, I would probably have to go look up the root of the word, but a monastery is basically, I mean, think of it just as a building. It's a place where religious brothers or sisters live in common. So monasticism is just that spiritual tradition of living in common, praying together, devoting your life to God. But it looks different depending on the order that you're in. I think that the church has the ideal that like sending the priests out 2 by 2 is the way to go. In fact, that's part of how Jesus sends out his disciples in the Gospels. He sends them out 2 by 2 because there's goodness in going together with someone else who you share the same mission. And the quickest way to failure, giving into self-doubt, listening to the temptations of the evil one, is when you're alone, is when you're isolated. So to go out 2 by 2 is a very, very good thing. And that's typically how it works. The problem with things nowadays is just that we don't have enough priests to cover everywhere. So like I'm the only priest at my parish. But ideally there would be a pastor and an associate pastor, at every parish.
So a Padawan and a master.
Right. Well, and there's even truth to that kind of an analogy. My first 4 years of my priesthood, I was an associate pastor, and I was essentially on the job training, Padawan. Even though I had all the theological academic training, that doesn't quite prepare you for what just on the ground life is like in the parish and dealing with people and the challenges and joys that come with parish life. So yeah, so I was essentially a Padawan for 4 years before I became a master. But I still feel like I'm in need of learning, and I don't feel like I know. I feel like I'm still learning every single day. So
I'm curious, just while we're still on the Jedi, the sort of warrior aspect of it. We get into the whole downfall of the Jedi because they were, out fighting these wars and stuff like that. But I'm just curious if there's any sort of parallel historically with Catholicism in terms of those sorts of responsibilities.
I'm actually going to relate this less on physical warriors because, I mean, obviously there have been wars throughout the history, and in Catholicism, there's what would be called just war theory. So there is justifiable reasons in which, we engage in war. I relate the warrior aspect, at least in priesthood, less about like we are out there on the front lines fighting and more on spiritual war that's happening. We're not physically fighting, but we recognize that that there is more to this world than the physicality, that there is this spiritual dimension too of trying to be holy, to be good, and to resist temptation and evil. And so the priests tend to fight in that realm more, and to help people to recognize the battle that they are in with temptation. And in fact, it's appropriate that we're talking about this during Lent. These 40 days from Ash Wednesday to more or less Easter Sunday, the 40 days that we engage in a particular way in that battle, in our driving to become holy. You're not going to find priests on the front lines in a war situation, but you're going to find them on the front lines in the spiritual war as they're guiding their people and their parishes.
You mentioned Lent and the 40 days, and that stems from the 40 days that Jesus spends in the desert. And then we see Obi-Wan Kenobi out there on his own in the desert and living on his own, but also watching over Luke. What else do you see in that connection?
Well, you nailed a lot of it, because actually in our podcast, we've been really anticipating this show because of the multiple themes that you just pointed out. There's the desert. Obi-Wan is this solitary figure. He is to some degree going to represent kind of the monastic sort of life. Obviously, when we see the show in May, I think things are going to happen that'll draw him out of that, hermit kind of monasticism. But even so, there's a concept called the monastery of the heart. And that's something that I try to kind of embody in my own priesthood, because what that is it's less of a physical place. Like I'm going to go to a monastery in the desert and sit and pray with God and grow closer to God, because that's not where God has called me to be in life. The monastery of the heart would be is that, in the busyness of my life and living in the world and ministering, when I pray, I kind of go to the monastery of my heart. And that's where I can really sit with the Lord and pray and grow closer to him. And that can be done if I'm sitting in the church before, the Blessed Sacrament praying, or if I'm, running to someone's house because they need anointing, that can be done wherever. And I think Obi-Wan is going to probably, embody that in a very cool way. He's lived through all sorts of things, the Clone Wars. And so he knew what life was like as a general in the Clone Wars, and probably recognizes that the Jedi Order had kind of lost their way. And his time in the desert would be a good opportunity for him to reflect on his whole past, but then where he goes from there. And we see where he goes from there. And he's a lot more calm. He's a lot more collected. He's a lot more just kind of in tune with the Force. And even just what he's called to do is to sacrifice for Luke in episode 4. I think that he'll model that monasticism in the desert, even though he's going to obviously go on some adventures. But even that's the story of good versus evil and the temptations of, Satan in the desert. And that's one thing too, just to point out, like the visuals of Star Wars are very clear. Darth Maul looks like Satan, but even like the Inquisitors, the Grand Inquisitor, just the way that he looks, he's meant to be that evil character.
Yeah, when you were talking about the spiritual or ideological sort of warriors instead of physical warriors, I haven't watched all of the Clone Wars, but I was thinking about how different it might be if that was sort of a quote unquote, I guess, regular war, whereas it was a war between droids and clones. And so like, can you fight that on a let's change their minds and hearts level? It's not really a question, but it was just a thought I was having that I'd never really considered, that maybe the Jedi had to get physically involved in that one, or felt they did.
Mm-hmm. Well, and even that's kind of an interesting point too, that like the droids, obviously you can program them to think whatever they want. So the droids, they aren't free in their choices. But watching the Clone Wars, you realize that the clones actually do indeed have free will. So there is an aspect there that perhaps the Jedi shouldn't have been generals, but they could still help guide and everything. Of course, that's not quite how it plays out. But I mean, we see some of the clones that really resist, Captain Rex really resisting that chip in his brain that wants him to shoot down Ahsoka.
Mm-hmm.
You mention the droids, and yet we hear C-3PO say, thank the maker, that obviously there might be some sort of belief system that some droids have. And what is that like when, you don't necessarily have free will, but you start creating a faith?
That's a really fascinating question, because Star Wars plays fairly loose with, do droids truly have free will or not? When you look at the Clone Wars, the battle droids, very clearly they're programmed to kill. But even they have personalities, like the battle droids tend to be kind of goofy and silly and say things that are funny. C-3PO and R2-D2 clearly have personalities. It's difficult, I guess, to kind of look at this from a faith perspective, just because, a droid is AI programming. From a faith perspective, a Catholic faith perspective, even though that there's an AI program there, and even though there's sort of a self-awareness, there is no actual rational soul. And so that would be one of the distinguishing characters between a living being versus a droid. Even if a droid could sort of articulate, C-3PO recognizes that he has a maker, but C-3PO, he would never be able to love in a way that we are able to love. Even though Star Wars kind of, like I said, kind of plays loose with it, and you almost can feel emotion from C-3PO, but there's still a difference there. There's not a soul. So I don't know if that answers the question. I think Star Wars likes to kind of throw that into the, well, what if droids have this analogous sort of thing to it, and what if they do have free will, and they kind of just let the viewers kind of sit with it and ponder it and whatnot.
Yeah. I would say, don't worry if you answered the question. We're talking about the question, which, as a scientist is more what I'm about, right? We don't have to get to any sort of conclusions, but these are all fun thought experiments.
Yep. Totally.
While we're on C-3PO, should we talk a little bit about the whole Ewok scene? That's one of those outright times in Star Wars where it's like, oh, there's something going on here religious. The movements to me were very, that's like a universal signal for worship. So I'm just sort of curious, like, what your thoughts about the Ewoks worshiping C-3PO are.
I mean, I definitely, as a kid, I thought it was funny. And I think it's sort of, it's meant to kind of play that way a little bit, at least for a kid who's kind of, You see C-3PO kind of flying through the air and all of that. Having a more mature look on things, though, it makes sense how they reacted. So, someone, a tribe, a people who have perhaps no real concept of a higher power, that would be kind of the initial reaction, and we see that the Ewoks are scared when they see C-3PO flying through the air. And of course that's how they are able to avoid getting eaten, and so they use that to their advantage. But something unknown like that is initially scary because you don't know what's going on. And I mean, even the people of the ancient worlds, it was, they would ascribe natural disasters to like the gods causing pain upon the people, or they did something wrong to offend the gods. Even in the Gilgamesh story of the flood is caused because the people became too noisy. And so like the god is just kind of irritated and causes the flood, and those are all examples just of if you encounter something like that, that's unknown, perhaps one of the first reactions would be fear. If you never saw lightning before in your life and you encounter a thunderstorm, I mean, that is terrifying. But the more that we learn, the more that we understand science and meteorology and all of that kind of stuff, we understand it and can figure it out. And then the same thing would be true with religion and God. Even though we can't know God fully, who he is in himself, we have learned a lot through Revelation, and Jesus revealed himself to us. And we don't look at God as a fearful being anymore, but they would have initially if you don't know. And the Ewoks, that's exactly how they reacted, was fear. And then I'm sort of assuming, you read between the lines, they become friends with Luke and Leia and all of them. So I have to imagine that some of that was sort of explained, that there's this thing called the Force, and the Ewoks are able to kind of grasp it better rather than seeing C-3PO so much as a deity. They kind of recognize that that's not quite what was going on. But
poor 3PO, he's like, I'm not a god anymore. They just explained me away. I'm just a golden droid.
It's not clear to me that they know C-3PO is not a god, right? He tells the story of the rebellion and those sorts of things. But in terms of explaining away the religion or not having that role of, an honorable, being for the Ewoks is not very clear.
That's my headcanon. Like, they talk about it off screen.
Right. Yeah, no, I'm sure. I mean, it makes sense. It just was interesting to me that it wasn't. And something I also learned, colonizers were seen as God, people were mistaken for gods, basically. Yeah. Someone shiny shows up on their shores. Yeah. And then there's also just the things they can do seem miraculous.
Yep.
It leads to a larger question. Things in the natural world having, no explanation. So the explanation comes up of deities. But after a while, you start realizing the natural world has rules that, you use science and you discover, oh, okay, this is the physics that caused this. This is the chemistry that causes this. But all of that goes out the window when the Force exists. So how, the Force breaks all the rules, essentially. So how does a religion that exists, or a whole society come into something when they realize the Force exists? And we have to now wrap our faith traditions around this power that exists that maybe we didn't know before.
Yeah, I would not take it quite that way. What you're referencing is that there is something that what we would call natural law, that there is a law in which the universe was created, and we would identify those as there's laws of physics, there's all sorts of things that sort of govern us that are beyond our control. The fact that we need to eat to survive is not something that we can just kind of turn off or turn on. It's something that's natural to how we are built. And so then when you look at then how does religion or faith or God fit into that, it should complement that. And now, in a faith tradition, you recognize that there are miracles that happen. And those break the laws of physics. Those break the natural law of things, but they don't necessarily mean that we have to reevaluate our entire existence or our how we were created. We recognize that God is doing something to reveal, his power, his healing, his mission on earth, but he's doing it in a particular way and for a particular reason. But ordinarily, the way that the natural order is governed he doesn't break into that. And I think the same thing would be true for Star Wars, is that, the Force does act in similar ways. The Force is basically analogous to this divine presence. I mean, depending on who you talk to, the Force is either a tool to be used but we also hear a lot about the will of the Force, so it's this kind of divine entity that's governing things, and that's actually prophecy kind of plays a role in that. But again, I would sort of look at it in that can mesh with your understanding of the universe and the cosmos without destroying everything that I ever thought I knew.
Well, and I'm curious to talk about Rogue One. So that came out when we were all adults. I assume you were already a priest by then. And I'm curious what the addition of Baze and Chirrut Imwe have to your idea of the Force and Catholicism having these sort of parallels. Where do they fit in? And, because it's sort of a different way of thinking about the Force. They have a different relationship with the Force than what I feel like we'd seen on screen before that.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't think I even kind of thought about it in that kind of a way. We do see those characters have this like deep reverence for the Force. Yeah, they don't quite use it or utilize it in the same way that we see a Jedi or a Sith. And actually, perhaps that would just be more an example of the faithful people, who are following the religion, but they're not necessarily the leaders. Or not that I want to equate the Jedi with priests and those characters with the lay faithful, but they don't share the same relationship or ability to use the Force, and yet they're perfectly happy to give their entire life to it. And I think that's part of what we're doing and how we're living our Catholic faith is that, I've given my life to this. Now, I have a different relationship to the Catholic religion in general as a priest than the lay faithful do, but we're still actually, we share the same mission, even though we relate to it differently.
It almost seems to me more that Baze and Chirrut are kind of more like the priests, that they have a deeper connection and they put more faith into it, perhaps. And while the Jedi themselves are the ones that use the Force, that they almost are the miracle workers that, because not only do they listen to the Force, but they channel it and use it to change things that otherwise wouldn't be changed.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I see it. But they also have these prophecies, where they're listening to the Force. So what do you think, like, the role of prophecy is, both in our real world and in the world of Star Wars?
From a Catholic point of view, prophecy is the gift that is given to a person by God to speak the words of God. So we have the prophets of the Old Testament. They had a unique relationship with God where God said, I need you to tell my people this. And they go and tell the people this. Prophecy in Star Wars is definitely, the same. It's a vocalization of the will of the Force. And of course, what they do in Star Wars is they do in a lot of just science fiction things. There's a lot more kind of vagueness to it. Anakin Skywalker being the chosen one, for example, is sure, it's a prophecy and ultimately it becomes true. But in the kind of science fiction mentality, it doesn't go the way that we expect it to. He becomes Darth Vader first before ultimately being redeemed and bringing balance to the Force at that point. Prophecy in the Catholic tradition, they're a little bit more straightforward, and it's sort of don't sin and turn back to God, where prophecy in Star Wars is sort of, I think, meant to be more of a kind of a plot device. And we kind of see the twists and turns of how the prophecy gets fulfilled. But in its core, it's pretty much the same. It's a voice of the will of the Force or a voice of the will of God.
This whole conversation is sort of blowing my mind a little bit. I guess I never really tried to line up any parallels or anything like that too much, but thinking about, Chirrut Imwe as sort of like the priest level, and then connecting with the God sort of level or the mythological level above that as being, the Jedi and the Sith and stuff like that, is really just sort of expanding my thoughts on religion about Star Wars. So This is really a great discussion.
Well, and again, like all of this it's a way for us to like understand ourselves better. So as we like play with these characters and kind of, fit them into their role in the Star Wars universe, it helps us to understand my role, your role, in our own universe and how we're trying to live and understand things. And that's one of the reasons why I love stories, but Star Wars in particular, I truly, truly, truly love it.
So do you think that the Jedi were on the right track in their beliefs that we have the Jedi Code? There is no emotion, there is peace, there's no ignorance, there is knowledge, there is no passion, there is serenity, there is no chaos, there is harmony, and there is no death, there is the Force. But we kind of see that through the movies that maybe the Jedi weren't quite on what we would think is the right path.
Right. Yeah, I see the Jedi and the Sith, I mean, as kind of, well, I don't want to say the extremes, but they're on both ends of the spectrum. And I've always had a problem with the Jedi Code because I think that it is too extreme. For example, there's no emotion, there's peace. That line itself sort of wants to deny our humanity. Like, we have emotions, and the emotions aren't the problem. It's if we let the emotions rule us, or if we learn how to deal with the emotions appropriately. I mean, everybody's going to be angry, when someone hurts you, but the Jedi way would be to respond with charity and forgiveness, and to recognize that I'm angry, but I'm called to forgive, rather than I'm going to punch this guy in the nose because he hurt me. And that would be more the Sith way to handle things. But like the Jedi, or at least the Jedi Code, I mean, we see that like Qui-Gon, I think, has a much more balanced approach to how to be a Jedi. And so the Jedi follow the code, I think, as best they can, some better than the others. But in general, the code, I think, is way too stoic and a denial of the humanity that actually we should embrace. I mean, God created us human. He created us with emotions, and to deny that is to deny the goodness that God created in us. And we see, I think, some of the result of someone who is basically called to suppress that. And that would be in how Anakin responds, to enter into this kind of secretive love affair with Padme, and to get married and to be secretive about it. But then he kind of goes overboard rather than that unconditional love, he wants to possess. And so that's what leads, of course, then to her death, is he's trying to just possess her rather than love her as he should. So yeah, I think the Jedi Code is too extreme. The Sith Code too. I actually have it pulled up. I'll read it because it's more or less the opposite. It says, "Peace is a lie. There's only passion. Through passion, I gain strength. Through strength, I gain power. Through power, I gain victory. Through victory, my chains are broken, and the Force shall set me free." So there too, it would be basically the contrary. So instead of stoic like the Jedi, they're all about passion and embracing that, and strength and gaining power and victory. And none of those things are inherently wrong, but they're doing it to possess, they're doing it to control, they're doing it, out of this kind of need to have themselves the most powerful. I think where a true Jedi should be is in the middle.
It's interesting to me how much of this part of the conversation harkens back to our episode about psychology, and how understanding human emotions, harnessing it, working through it, acknowledging it, not denying things, is really sort of the best way to live. I always had a problem with it because, Yoda says some of these lines in the original trilogy that are just sound so wise, but honestly are so wrong. It's like, no. Right. And watching that as a kid, it was just like, oh, it's like how influential, I don't know, was that, versus talking to Dr. Drea, where she was like, no, I mean, just talk about your emotions, work through them. It's episode 6, by the way.
I will have to listen to that. You're absolutely right. And I'm appreciative for characters like Ahsoka, who kind of was raised in that, and then, leaves the Jedi Order, but still pursues what is right. And she's an awesome character and a role model. You don't have to stick to the Jedi Code for you to be considered a good guy or the hero. And in fact, I think that if you stick to that, we see what happens, the downfall of the Jedi.
Yeah, well, I want to be respectful of your time, Father Andrew, but I'd love to talk about the Mandalorian.
Let's hit the Mandalorian.
Okay. Again, I'm still getting through the Clone Wars, so I didn't really see it coming, the whole Children of the Watch sort of cult-like or sect. And I'm just sort of curious what that means to someone who's religious.
I mean, I would see them as similar, as sort of an extremist group. And while and yeah, we've had conversations about this on the podcast a lot, but essentially he's extreme in his views, and he's been raised in this. So Din was raised in the Children of the Watch, and has fully given his life to the creed. And yet, as we're watching, even he recognizes that it's not as fulfilling, I think, as he thinks it should be. So one of the key examples would be have you ever removed your helmet? And that whole idea that you keep your helmet on from a metaphorical standpoint, you're keeping your mask on, you're putting a boundary between relationships. And so coming from our perspective, like relationships are crucial in who we are as human beings and flourishing and happiness. And so it was really interesting to watch Din travel through the 2 seasons and encounter Grogu and recognize that relationship was more important than the creed of not removing his helmet, because he removes his helmet to save him. But then even at the end of season 2, he removes his helmet to have that actual encounter with Grogu. So we're sort of wondering on our podcast kind of, where this is going to lead him, because to ascribe to the creed as the children of the Watch see it, it's very extreme. And ultimately, at least from my point of view, isn't going to lead to his fulfillment and happiness, which is kind of the point of any religion, is to pursue happiness and joy. And that's found, in God and in relationships. And so it's interesting to see Din kind of struggle with that through the 2 seasons. And of course, there's other just kind of more fun things to point out about the religion. Weapons are his religion. So obviously in the Mandalorian culture, weapons are part of their key to the pursuit of happiness, which totally makes sense when you consider them as a culture, or at least the Children of the Watch. I guess if you watch the Clone Wars, there's a pacifist group as well. But one of the other things that I would point out too is that in the Book of Boba Fett, when we see Din and the Armorer have that discussion about the creed, Din makes the point that loyalty and solidarity are key aspects of the creed, as opposed to the Jedi, which forego all attachments. And I thought that was interesting, because I would agree that solidarity and loyalty are very key in who we are. The creed is just, it's a little too far, because he can't have true solidarity if you're going to have that barrier between you and another person. And that's, of course, the mask issue. That tends to be the sticking point of everything.
Wow. No, that definitely connects, that their adherence to the letter of the law, as opposed to doing what is right from their own hearts, that, loyalty and solidarity. And just as you mentioned, that the fact that the mask is a barrier to that's pretty deep.
Mm-hmm. The Armorer and Paz Vizsla, I mean, they've survived, and they're accrediting that to their adherence to the way. I tend to disagree. I'm glad that they're kind of secretive and their off the grid kind of way of living did save them from the destruction of Mandalore. But I think the Armorer is placing too much credit in the strict, letter of the law, fundamentalist kind of adherence to the way as the reason. So a bit of a superstitious sort of aspect of believing the creed is what saved them. And we see that in religion and in our world too, is practices can change. The content of the faith won't ever change, but the practice of it, the discipline, how we do it, has changed drastically, and how we celebrate Mass now compared to how we celebrated Mass 2,000 years ago. And some of those things can definitely be influenced by culture or just newer things, but they don't change the deposit of faith. But if you just cling to something old and never change, I think that's problematic, and I think that's not going to bode well for this particular sect.
You mentioned before that you don't always talk about Star Wars in your homilies, but you're free to talk about it afterwards. But how can Star Wars be a tool to connecting faith concepts to the public?
Well, you just described what we did for the last hour. For example, if someone just met me out of the blue and they don't know me, but they know I'm a priest, the fact that I like Star Wars is often a way in which they can then relate to me and then talk to me. If you have this sort of like the priests are unapproachable and I don't know how to talk to a priest, we're a human just like everybody else. So we have, the hobbies and the passions, and, I'm a geek. So, so if someone wants to come and talk Star Wars with me, and then they can relate it to faith and kind of explore that, it's a way in which we can come together and have that conversation. Yeah, it doesn't kind of put me in an isolated kind of bubble and nobody wants to talk to me. Star Wars is a great way to connect, because even if you haven't seen the movies, of Star Wars. I mean, it's so big in the culture. Actually, it was really kind of fun. There's a family in my parish that had never seen Star Wars before. I became friends with them because they were coming into the church. And so, of course, I'm going to start to talk about Star Wars at some point with them. And I had a particular viewing order of the movies that I encouraged them to watch. And so that was really fun. So for example, I had them watch episode 4 first, then Rogue One is sort of like, okay, here's what happened before episode 4, and then watch episode 5, and then episodes 1, 2, and 3. So then you see the background of what led Anakin to become Darth Vader, and then you finish with episode 6. So
Truly
it was
dizzying.
So it's the machete order, but throwing Rogue One in after A New Hope.
Yeah, even that has been a fun way to just connect with people, and it can be a way to talk about faith. It can be a way to talk about good versus evil. It can be a way to talk about just morality. Did Luke do right in what he did, or what? And especially with younger kids, they're watching the Clone Wars or Rebels, or it's a way to talk about human life, but from this sandbox that we call Star Wars.
Father Fett says skip Solo and the sequels.
That's not what he said.
Yeah. I do really like Solo. The sequel trilogy I'm less fond of as time goes on.
But you also mentioned that you used to read the novels that are now legends. We used to know them as the expanded universe. Does that mean that when you give mass, there's an EU Eucharist?
There's the dad joke. Oh, very, very well done, sir. That is probably the biggest reason why I don't like the sequels, is because I loved the Legends books, and I was so looking forward to new Legends books. And then when Disney bought Lucasfilm, all of that became Legends, and Jaina Solo just ceased to exist. And I love her character so much. So
Fair enough.
That's my biggest. We could talk about The Last Jedi, and there are issues that I take with those, but in general, I appreciate the movies. But I miss Legends.
That's fair. Well, we should probably wrap up. If someone's interested in getting into religious studies or into the ministry itself, how would you recommend going about that?
Sure. So definitely the first place to go would be to go to your local parish and talk to your priest about it. The process of someone who is called to be a priest, to become a priest, is quite extensive. It's basically you get a philosophy degree in college, and then there's a 4-year theological degree that you get, but you have to be connected to a diocese to do that. So first step would be to talk to your pastor, and you can get involved, of course, in the parish in various ways without having to become a priest either. There's always ways to give to the parish, to the community, and your pastor is going to be the first one who would be able to connect you with the right people and get on that track. And even if it's just, you're going to pray more, that's a way to give back to the parish too, and to pray for our country and our world, especially with everything going on. So talk to your pastor.
Where can we find you? You mentioned your podcast. Where are you on social media? Do you have a blog you want to talk about?
My biggest thing on social media is Instagram. And so I'm on Instagram at Father Fett, all one word. I'm also on Twitter at A Kinstetter. So that's AKINSTETTER. And then, of course, if you want to listen to my podcast, it's called The Secrets of Star Wars. It's part of a podcast network called SQPN, which is the StarQuest Production Network. We do a bunch of podcasts that talk about the intersection of faith and pop culture. I host one called Secrets of Star Wars, but there's all sorts of other ones too. Star Trek, Doctor Who. Just Google search Secrets of Star Wars and you'll find me.
That's great. I love that idea. Like with James and I seeing science everywhere, I like the idea that there's also people seeing topics about religion to talk about in pop culture.
It's a lot of fun.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Father Andrew. I really enjoyed this conversation. I feel like I have all sorts of things to think about.
And it was a joy to be here with you both. So thank you for having me on.
Well, thank you. That wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank our guest, Father Andrew Kinstetter, and we want to thank all of you for listening. If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Twitter and Instagram, or at Star Warsologies, that's StarWarsologies at gmail.com. Please also rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service.
We are part of the Skywalking Network, where you can also find a variety of great shows about Star Wars, Disney, Marvel, including Talking Apes, the Mac FX podcast, Resilient Squadron, and the flagship show, Skywalking Through Neverland. There's also a YouTube show, Today in Star Wars History. You can find all of this at skywalkingnetwork.com.
And remember, for our show, no topic is off limits, even the taxation of trade routes and outline systems. And we might even just touch on that in our next episode when we bring in economics and Star Wars.
See you next time on Star Warsologies.